Hi, and welcome to a Small Medium at Large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate stories that heal. Today, we have Major Paul H. Smith, a retired Army intelligence officer, Desert Storm veteran, and a 7-year veteran of the Department of Defense's Stargate remote viewing psychic spy program. He is president and chief instructor for Remote Viewing Instructional Services Incorporated, and he is also a founding director and two-time past president of the nonprofit International Remote Viewing Association. His book, Reading the Enemy's Mind, was a Reader's Digest book bonus feature and editor's choice selection. He is also author of The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. Both books are considered authoritative in the remote viewing field. He also co-produced Learn Dowsing and Remote Perception Home Study courses. Paul earned his Ph.D. from the University of Texas at Austin in philosophy, focusing on philosophy of mind, consciousness, philosophy of science, and philosophy of parapsychology. He also has a BA from Brigham Young University and an MS from the National Intelligence University, both concentrating in Middle East studies. Paul has been interviewed frequently by national and international media. He has spoken at numerous academic and popular conferences, including those of the Society for Scientific Exploration, the Society for Psychical Research, the International Remote Viewing Association, the Parapsychological Association, Paulo Harris's Starworks USA, the Rhine Research Center, and many other places. Let's welcome Paul here today. Hi, Paul.
Thank you. Based on that, you'd think I was never home.
I think you've been very busy.
Yeah, true.
Which home is where I actually want to begin. I always like to ask my guests in their childhood, in their growing up family, in the years that they were developing, were there things like, did you grow up in a military family and that's why you ended up going on a military route? Did you get exposed to parapsychological or psi or any sort of things as you were growing up that might have planted seeds for you to end up doing some of the work you've done in the future? Or was it just a normal family life? Nothing happened, and it was later in life that you discovered all these things?
Well, we'll start with, did I grow up in a military family? No.
Okay.
No, my dad did 2 years in the Navy at the tail end of World War II, long before I came around, right? But I was in that post-war generation where I was fascinated by military things, all the heroic stories of U.S. exploits in combat and all that, and so I did have a kind of an affinity for the military. Although by the time I hit high school, I decided there's no way I would want to be in the military because didn't want anybody telling me what to do, right? Well, it was only later that I found out there's never a time when there isn't somebody who can tell you what to do. And once you get married, that's a given, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So ultimately I won't go through the details, but I in a way sort of accidentally ended up in the Army, despite having, so I was one of the draft lottery folks, right? And I was born on August 13th. So I turned 13 on Friday the 13th. And I thought, oh no, my draft lottery number is going to be 1 or 2 or 3, which would guarantee you to go, right? Well, when the lottery was over with, mine was 365.
Oh.
Which meant I was 1A my entire career, never had to worry about the draft the whole time I was in and then I ended up joining the Army anyway. Can you imagine?
Oh,
right? Yeah. So anyway, let's see. Now the second part of this was ESP.
yes, if that was around in your childhood or...
It was in a way, right? I'd never had any psychic thing happen to me, but I was fascinated by the idea.
Oh.
I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy as a kid, and some of my favorite authors incorporated ESP into their stories. The ones that come immediately in mind are Andre Norton and Zena Henderson, and off the top of my head, I'm blanking on who else, but there's a number of them. And I found that whole concept fascinating. But then in junior high, I was part of a science fair project that used the ESP cards, the the circles and the
No,
squares and the wavy
yes.
lines and the stars, right? To see if we could provide any evidence of being psychic, and it totally failed. I showed no evidence whatsoever of being psychic, nor did anyone else. And so I became a bit of a, I like to say, mild skeptic. I thought, well, this is fun stuff, but I'm not sure there's really anything to it. So, and that was kind of the mindset I was in. So, what were there other questions? I forget.
So there was you had some experiences growing up
Oh,
where
right.
one, you were drawn to military things that were going on.
Yeah.
And the other was you did have some tendencies towards things that you found in science fiction books. So things were stimulating in your mind around these
I
ideas.
was interested in it, but had become doubtful. Let's put it that way.
Okay. So my next question is, I don't know which listeners we have here that have ever even heard of the word remote viewing. So this is sort of a three-part question, and it's A, what is the definition of remote viewing? B, how did you get involved in becoming a remote viewer? And C, something that I find interesting that I'd like to know, since I've been remote viewing now, I realized I started in 1998 with Russell Targ and Dean Raid. And so I'm getting on the, couple of decades here of doing this. And yet I don't know the explanations of CRV. I've never done CRV, and there's different aspects of remote viewing. So I was wondering if you could just explain what remote viewing is, how you got into remote viewing, what the different types are, because I believe you specify the CRV type of remote viewing, and that is also what you teach. And I don't know how to do that. So I would love to know something
Okay.
about
Well, a golden opportunity,
it.
right?
Yeah.
I hope I don't bore you. So,
You won't.
well, first off, remote viewing it's not exactly a new phenomenon in the ESP domain. It's really an approach to the underlying ability we all have to know things non-locally. In other words, know things that we shouldn't had ought to be able to know just based on normal physical means, such as our five senses, right? It's essentially a skill set or a developed ability, maybe, to access persons, places, events, objects that are otherwise undetectable by you, the remote viewer, due to distance, like on the other side of the planet, shielding, like maybe locked in a safe, or time in the past or the future. Okay. And it is a form of extrasensory perception, because our senses, at least as actual direct access to the world, are not involved in this. People get confused what extrasensory perception means. They think extrasensory perception, well, that means we have one more sense. And so I hear people talk about the sixth sense or the seventh sense, and that's actually nonsense. Okay. That's not what it means. It doesn't mean you have an additional sense. What it means is you are able to access experiences and information without the mediation of your physical senses. In other words, your physical senses are just bypassed. And it's strictly a mental-based phenomenon. Okay. And it deals with channels or means that the mainstream science denies even exist. So we're 300, 400, 500 years ago, they'd say magic, right? But we know today that the humans do have this faculty that allow us to experience, perceive things that, according to the rules of the physical universe, you shouldn't be able to do, right? And so remote viewing is just a process of doing that. And there are various methods of remote viewing. It started off, there were really only 3, and then that's multiplied about 50 times, I guess.
Really?
Yeah. And so how did I get into this? Well, when I first was introduced to remote viewing, I was in the state that many of your listeners probably are in right now. You'd never put the words remote and viewing together, right? I had no clue. I'd never heard the term before. I did not know what it had to do with. And I was actually stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. I just moved in there after a tour in Europe with the Special Forces, and then a school for Army captains when everybody goes through. And then I was at Fort Meade, and I had a job as a Mideast desk analyst. So I collected reports on Middle Eastern topics that the intelligence community was interested in, and passed different kinds of requests and requirements around and that kind of thing. It's kind of a bookkeeping job, and so I wasn't all that thrilled by it. But what I didn't know is I'd moved in next door to the training and operations officer for the remote viewing unit, and across the street from one of the remote viewers. Tom McNair and Skip Atwater lived next door. In fact, we shared a wall. We were in these kind of townhouse-like units. And one day they knocked on my door and they said, we think you might be good at what we do. And I said, what do you do? And they said, we can't tell you. I said, well, how am I going to know? All right. What I didn't know was that, the whole story, Stanford Research Institute, now SRI International, had a contract to train military remote viewers. And so Skip and Tom were going around trying to identify people who they think might be successful at that. And it's not something you advertise, right?
Right.
We need remote viewers for a top secret program, right? And so you sort of they were sort of stuck with investigating their acquaintance pool in the area, which is, fairly sizable. So we're not talking about just having to take anybody that came along. I landed on the radar, and let me tell you why I landed on the radar. So turns out what they were looking for were military intelligence officers who were well vetted in their career, good report cards, had not embarrassed themselves or the country anywhere along the way. And in addition to being competent in the military profession, having a side interest that we might call right brain or creative, right? So like art of some kind, drawing, sculpting, painting, whatever, creative writing, perhaps music, and languages, being engaged in languages. Now that latter isn't all that unusual for the military, particularly military intelligence, but still, that was an indicator. Well, they got to know me and discovered that I'd majored in art at Brigham Young to start with, and that I had illustrated books. And I had some of my paintings and stuff on the walls, right? And they discovered I've been playing guitar for about 20 years. And they also discovered that I like to write short stories and send them off and get them rejected. And further, I was fluent in German and had competency in Arabic and Hebrew. So they got to know me and said, well, we can't not try this guy out. so they came and they gave me some psychology and personality tests, just kind of standard ones mostly, although a few specialized ones. And I scored where they were kind of expecting me to, and then they read me onto the program. Tom takes me over to the office, and I still don't know what's going on. He says, okay, our mission here is to collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychology discipline called remote viewing. Essentially, we're inviting you to volunteer to become a psychic spy, right? And so this was the thought. Well, this is the thought that went through my head while he's talking. And when he finished that little statement, he said, now you don't have to tell us right now. He said, you have 24 hours to think it over. Here are the 3 things you can tell your wife about this. Because we want her to know as much as possible without giving too much away, right? And I said, oh, nope, I don't need any of that. Where do I sign? I absolutely want to do this. And what was going through my head at the time, as he's talking, I'm thinking, I used to really be interested in ESP. I decided the ESP didn't work. He's telling me there's a line item in the federal budget that's funding a program that teaches people how to do this. It must work after all. There's no way I'm not going to do this.
And the government wasn't funding other projects like that. Was that the first of its kind?
Well, that's a much longer history. No, the very first funding happened in 1973, and this was 10 years later, right? And it had gone through a couple of iterations. The CIA had sponsored it, and then the Air Force, and then the Defense Intelligence Agency, and now the Army had its own program, DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. It was still running, but it was more of a administrative research angle. The Army was actually doing practical use with it. And so, yeah, so it wasn't the first of its kind, but it was a continuation of something that 10 years ago had been totally novel, right? Totally new.
Mhm. And so you started in the program and you started working at Fort Meade in those funky old little buildings that everybody thought was just sort of nothing there. Nobody thought anything was going on inside them. So
Yeah,
other military personnel did not know what you were doing. Only the
yeah.
people that were involved in the program knew what was happening at that time.
The height of the program, there's a list somewhere. There were approximately 150 people in the entire military, entire US government that knew the program existed. There are, I think, a wider range of people who suspected but didn't know, but it was kept very tightly held. One of the reasons was people say, well, it's because they didn't want the Congress to find out, because then then they'd be a laughing stock and Congress would shut it down. But frankly, a number of those folks were Congress people, senators, Congress people. In fact, the Vice President of the United States knew about it, and they were all read on to the program, and a lot of congressional staffers. So the main reason is because the most effective defense against a remote viewer is to kill them. And so we didn't want that to happen. So probably the most tightly held secret of the remote viewing program was who the remote viewers were, any identifying features of that. And there are other things that had to be carefully guarded as well, but that was probably the most important thing.
So some years ago, it was Russell Targ.
May I drink on camera?
What's that?
May I drink on camera?
Oh, please. And we like to be very relaxed here, so no worries on anything. So when Russell and his son, who's a lawyer, declassified this information, did that open that up for everybody that was involved to be able to start writing books and doing things? Or I'm not sure, is that the clincher that let everything come out of the bag?
So again, it's a little more complicated, right?
Okay.
Russell had a set of very specific documents declassified. But he was able to do that because of something that happened before that. And that was, okay, so I'll tell you the complicated story, but I'll make it fairly simple, right?
Okay.
So from 1986 to 1995, the Defense Intelligence Agency had the whole program. The Army went out of the business, transferred all of its remote viewing assets to DIA. And DIA then became the home for everything, right? Towards in the early 90s, DIA was starting to not be pleased with it. So the commanding general that kicked remote viewing out of the Army was a guy named Harry Soyster. He was brought in to replace the guy who was a friend of it, Bert Stubblebine. Soyster replaced Stubblebine. Soyster had marching orders to get rid of the remote viewing program for other complicated reasons I won't get into. And he proceeded to do that, but he was going to cancel the program, but DIA had a little more horsepower because it's another echelon up from the Army, and said, no, you're not going to do that. We want it. We want the program. And okay, it's out of the Army. I don't care, right? This was Soyster's approach. So it ends up at DIA. Well, long towards the end of the 80s, I want to say 89, but I could be a little off on that. Soyster becomes director of DIA.
Oh, so now he wants to get rid of it again.
Yes. He was kind of forced to keep it on because by then we had five or six influential senators and a number of Congress people who were supporters. And so you can't just kill a program that Congress likes, right? So, and they kept giving money to DIA to keep the program running, but they were looking for an out. And finally, they decided they were going to transfer the program to CIA. Problem was the CIA didn't want it either. In fact, their director, a guy named, I'm going to say Robert Deutsch. I keep thinking I need to look that name up. I think it's Robert Deutsch. He was absolutely anti-remote viewing. And here they are trying to foist that program on CIA. I don't know exactly all the machinations of how that happened, but ultimately, the program was transferred on effectively 30 June 1995. That was the official transfer date. On 30 June 1995, the CIA terminated the program. They got the rights to it and they immediately canceled it. They it never operated, which is ironic because they call it the CIA Stargate program, but it was never run by the CIA. They just had the authority to kill it, and they did.
So is that when it closed down in Stanford also, any of the work that was done there?
Yes,
Yeah.
at least closed down as a government-funded operation, right?
Mhm.
Because up to that time, the government had been funding the remote viewing lab, by then run by Ed May, right? Russell left the program in 1982. Hal Putoff, the other co-leader of the program, and really the founder of the program,
Mhm.
but he and Russell became partners on that. Hal left in 1985 for really a sweetheart deal. It doesn't matter what that is, but he got a really great offer and he couldn't resist. And Ed May took over, and Ed May ran it until 1995 when the government pulled the skids out from under it. But what that did was it removed any justification the government had to keep it classified, right? And so it took them quite a while to go through the documents, make sure there were no sensitive sources and methods implicated in any of it, and declassify everything. But it gave an opening for Russell and his son to do a Freedom of Information Act for specific documents that Russell knew they had. And then that allowed him to get access to those and publish them.
And be able to create his book and movies, Third Eye Spies, to share all that information with the world.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, I did not know, I had never heard the term remote viewing before in my life until I met Dean and Russell, and they interviewed me. They were doing something called the Phenom Project. In 1998, Russell said to me, okay, I want you to meet me at the office here. This was I had no training or any kind of experience. And I want to say, in reading your book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, I agree with you about it really would have been a very better coining than remote viewing, remote perception. I think that's a really, because you're perceiving these things. It just seemed, I think you were right on changing that thought, that would have been a very good title. And so all I was told was, it's 1 o'clock right now, Gail. This was my whole introduction to remote viewing. It's 1 o'clock and you're going to take a piece of paper and draw what impressions and things that come to you. I love doing remote viewing with Russell. He's the best monitor ever. And tell us what you think the computer's going to select at 3 o'clock. And Ed May was the judge of these. We would do 20 at a time, and that's how we got to know each other. So when we were doing them, I didn't know what I was supposed to do because I thought you had to be trained. So I really had no idea what was going to happen. But I would sit down and these visions would come in my mind. I would hear these things and I would tell Russell and I'd write them on the paper. And then 2 hours later, the photo would be selected. And I would look at the things, I'd say, how did I do that? I mean, I didn't even know that I could do such a thing. So I've always felt being a subject for them teaches me stuff about myself that I didn't even know. So we do it, and he tells me that my attention to detail in my remote viewing is as good as Pat Price. But at that time, I didn't know who Pat Price was and that he was a well-known remote viewer. I continued doing this, and at the end of the 20, Ed May judged them. And the funniest thing that had happened was that in a lot of the photos, I would be describing people, cars, boats, but then the picture would come up and there'd be nothing in there of those. And when I said to Ed May, I said, I felt really like I couldn't understand because I really felt in my gut that they were there. And he said, oh, we erased those all out of the photos. So I was picking up things that had been erased out, which made me think of Russell's saying always, it's like a beacon of light, the thing you're trying to hide. And light comes out to you more. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, he's hiding what's in the picture. I'm getting marked wrong because It's not there.
Well, you know what that kind of tells me is
What?
that you weren't so much remote viewing the photo as you were remote viewing the actual scene at the time the photo was taken.
That's what it must be.
Yeah. And, there's this problem that a lot of people, particularly in the science realm, they want to do photos. And the reason is because you know exactly what the data is in that photo. If you do an actual target, a real location, then there's all kinds of things in there you might not know are there, and yet the viewer will report on, right? And then you can't evaluate how successful they were. You kind of have to count that stuff as a miss because you can't verify it. In a science thing, you want to have your data set fully constrained so that you can statistically evaluate how well the process has occurred. So you kind of screwed them up by remote viewing the actual target anyway.
So tell me, there were three, if you could just give us the definition for our listeners of CRV,
Yes,
precognitive, and I think, what was it called? On location or outbound?
outbound. Okay, so
Those
those
are
are
the
three relatively unconnected things. So first off, I want to say about remote perception. I can't take credit for coming up with that term. Actually, Brenda Dunn, I think, was the first to really think of using that terminology way back when, back in the mid 70s, when she started replicating the SRI Targ Putoff research. She chose to call it remote perception. I think that she had the insight that there's really, it's more than just viewing. Ingo Swann, who's the one who originated the whole thing in the first place. In fact, that you can see part of him on the wall behind me.
I can see I can see his mom, his goatee,
Yeah,
his beard.
from the eyes down, you can see him from the eyes down.
Could you tell our audience, a lot of people don't know who Ingo Swann
Yeah,
is?
Ingo Swann was he was a New York artist. Now here's an interesting thing. I live in southern Utah, right?
Okay.
Ingo Swann was born in Telluride, Colorado, before Telluride was a thing, right? Before it was real, a go-to place. He's born there, but his family ultimately moved to Tooele, Utah, up in northern Utah. And that's where he really grew up, is in Utah. And so he went to school in Utah and ended up joining the army and going to Korea and all of that. But so, we share a state, so to speak, right? Anyway, he had gotten out of the army, gone to New York, was trying to make it as an artist, and got involved in the parapsychology community there. At the time, was very robust. There was the American Society of Psychical Research with Carlos Osas. Gertrude Schmeidler is a professor at the City College of New York, and she was doing some this is really well done scientific research into parapsychology. And Ingo became one of their subjects. Now, he hated that term, but since he's not around, I'm going to use it, right? He became one of their subjects. And he gets into it, and he says, you know what? This is real interesting. There's supposed to be out-of-body research, right? This is all well and good, but you know what? You're doing it wrong. And they go, what? And he comes up with this protocol or way of doing experiment that just blew the doors off of things. It was really, it's so simple. It's hard to imagine why they hadn't figured this out before, but they did it. And he called it remote viewing.
So
He
he is
said,
the person to coin that word.
yes. Well, he came up with a process and he came up with the term. And that's one of the reasons it stuck, because the guy who originated remote viewing also originated the term remote viewing. And so that's what we use. But he was much more visually oriented. He had a double major in biology and art, painting, studio art. And so he's very visually oriented, and he tended to perceive things visually. But in the actual remote perception, remote viewing in general, and he taught it this way, it's not just visual. You can smell, taste, touch, feel, hear, and then there's also kinesthetic experiences you have in the process that you learn how to extrapolate and record and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a multi-sensory element in which the senses aren't involved. I mean, there's a huge irony, almost a paradox here, right? It comes through as a sensory experience, and yet it doesn't come through your actual senses. So remote perception is great. It's perceptual. That's really the best term for it. And remote perception is best, but I didn't originate that concept, but I'm happy to help promote it.
Well,
So,
I have to share an Ingo Swann story because I just happened to find this photo, and I don't even remember how old this is. But I was in New York at the same time as Russell, and he said, "I want you to meet Ingo Swann." And he takes his friend and me. He wanted to talk to him about a book cover or something. And we arrive at his door in the Bowery. He opens the door and he lets us in. And I feel this vibe from him like that. I don't know what to say or do. My husband is there also. And he's like ignoring us like we do not exist. And I'm a sensitive type, so my feelings are starting to get hurt. Like, this guy won't even acknowledge my presence in his house. And he says something to Russell about, how could you dare bring someone to my house and not tell me that you're bringing them here? So I'm feeling really bad. And all of a sudden, I don't know what I said, but whatever I said switched him from, "Why did you bring her here?" to him telling me all this stuff about my life. He was the first person to tell me, and I wish he was here today, that he could hear me say, "Thank you. You're the one who knew this was my path that was coming, and I didn't." But when I met him, he said to me, "You know what your problem is?" He said, "You're a shaman." He said, "You just don't know how to act like a shaman and behave correctly like a shaman, but you are a shaman." I thought to myself, a shaman? What kind of weird thing is that to say, right? And we had some kind of wonderful connection by the end of this conversation that led me to visit him numerous other times and to have wonderful psychic interactions with him. But I just found the photo, which I read about in your book, of the millennial painting.
Yeah.
And that's me, Ingo, Russell, and Lisa Ashman in front of that painting. I don't know, this has been sitting in a drawer for, I don't know, 15 years. I don't know, it just popped back into my life, and I never knew where these
It
photos
should be framed and hanging on your wall.
Well, now it will be, even if it's a little blurry.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yes, but I found him, it was like him and I were walking down the street, and some guy was coming this way, and I all of a sudden got this like, and he just turned to me and said, "Yeah, he's gonna die soon." And I'd never been with someone that was like me, that could say these feelings that just sort of pop out of nowheres. And before I went to visit him on another visit, I wanted to bring him the perfect flower. And I didn't know what his favorite flower was. And I stood there in one of those New York flower shops on the corner, viewing all the flowers. And I picked this huge bouquet of, what's it called? It's a daisy. Oh God, the first name is not coming to me right this second, but Gerber. It's the Gerber daisy.
Okay.
So I bring him this whole bouquet of daisies, and he opens his door and he looks at me and he says, "You brought my favorite flower." So I just felt like we had such a lovely, nice thing together. And one day when we were there, I said, "I need to talk to you about sexual energy, because anyone I talk to about remote viewing never wants to talk about sexual energy." I said, "But when I do remote viewing, after I do it, I have a tremendous amount of sexual energy." He said, "Oh, okay." And he passes me his book about sexual. He said, "Just take this home and read this."
Psychic sexuality. Yeah. We'll put in a plug for his book, Psychic Sexuality. Yeah.
So that was, I just had to share with the audience that as I read your book, all of these different people I met later in life, and I love seeing how they began together, all of you, and also everybody looked young with hair,
Don't rub it in, okay?
Well, everybody looked quite great. And I feel like I'm sort of like touching on, I got to get to know this group in little pieces because of Russell introducing me to all of you. So I'm very grateful for that. So I want to go back to our remote viewing situation, which is, I'd like to know.
Well, now we haven't talked about CRV yet.
Oh, wait, let's go CRV.
In fact, you had 3 things you wanted to hear about. We haven't hit any of them.
CRV, Precog, and
Outbound.
Outbound.
Well, let's talk about Outbounder, because that's probably the most germane to what we've just been talking about, and that's Ingo Swann. So one of the experimental procedures that he developed was a thing called an Outbounder, or a beacon experiment. The idea was, so the first thing about remote viewing, one of the first crucial protocols is the elements of the protocol is that the viewer cannot know anything about the target to start with. They cannot be told what the target is. They can't have any hint or suggestion of what it is. And the reason is because if they do, then all of their preconceptions come into their head. Their preconception stuff they already know, whatever, just becomes a lot of noise about the target when in fact, they may be supposed to remote view something nobody knows about the target, right? And so if all the stuff they think they know about is right there, it kind of smothers this very subtle signal that carries the information that is real and needed. And so the viewer cannot know anything about the target. Well, then you run into a problem. How do you get the viewer to go where you need him to go? When I say go, I mean mentally, go where you need him to go. And Ingo hit on this idea. He said, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll get one or two people or three, whatever, some people that act as an outbound team because they go from the viewing location out to a target, okay?
Physically.
Yeah, and so you have the viewer and maybe an interviewer or monitor with the viewer. Both of them are blind to the target. The monitor can't know what the target is either for fear that he or she will accidentally telegraph information to the viewer. So they're both blind. They're in a room that's sealed so that it's sealed in the sense that there's no way they know where this outbound team is going. Then there's a target pool, say 100 targets in there, and they use a random number generator to say pick target 63. And so they take 63, they don't know where it is. They go out somewhere where the viewer's not going to be able to see it or hear anything. They open it up and it says, I'll use my favorite example. Go to the Eiffel Tower. We'll pretend like this is happening in Paris. All right. Go to the Eiffel Tower. And so then the outbound team goes to the Eiffel Tower. They touch it. They look at it. They take pictures of it. They comment about it. Maybe they go up in the elevators. They interact with this target for a certain period of time, as much as is possible. Meantime, the viewer's back in the room, not knowing where they went. The monitor doesn't know where they went. The monitor says, okay, we'll say it's Bill and Sally or the outbound team, right? So I want you to imagine in your mind where Bill and Sally are. And it isn't that they want him to say they're at the Eiffel Tower. They want the viewer to say, okay, well, I'm getting impressions that they're at this place, that there's this huge structure and it's made out of metal and there's lots of holes in it. And I hear clanging sounds and rushing sounds like traffic. And I smell food smells and chirping and echoey and all of this stuff, right? In black, metallic, flaking, flaking paint, whatever, right? And then what is happening is the people in the outbound team, there are people that get confused about this. They think that somehow it's a telepathic thing, that the viewer is actually accessing the mental contents of the people and they're seeing things through their eyes. No, it's not that at all. The idea is that you use them as a beacon. They're like a flashlight out there shining a light. You find the flashlight, find the beacon, and then you are able to place your consciousness in that area and explore the surroundings of where the beacon team is, right? And then they come back and the classic models, they come back, get you and take you there. So you have actually in-person live experiential feedback about what the target is. And that's an outbounder experiment. Okay, so to overcome that idea, the problem of getting the viewer to the target without the viewer knowing what target they're going to, right?
Right, and the monitor doesn't know either, so
Yeah.
it's double blind.
Exactly. So
And is that
go ahead.
considered the most difficult of remote viewings, or is that considered the easiest?
It's actually one of the easiest because they
Mhm.
very what's the word I want to say? Stephen has a word, numinous kind of a thing, I guess, but that word doesn't tell much to people, right? So it's a very analog kind of a process, right? It's like you're dealing with people you know or met recently. You're dealing with a concrete location. You're dealing with a very tightly connected sort of a deal. You're not exploring the world, you're going where they are, right? And I just find a lot of success with it. I've used it when I've done television interviews and the TV crew wants me to do a demo and I'll say, well, we'll have a demo and say, oh, great. And I'll say, but I'm not going to do it. What? You have to. I said, no, I don't. You have to. And I talk them through the process and set up an outbounder kind of a thing. They're totally blind, and it's almost universally been successful. They're very, and the beauty of that is that if I do it, then they think, oh, he may have cheated somehow, right? But if they do it, they know exactly what they knew, when they knew it, and how they knew it, and they know it was real. They don't have to second guess me, right?
And that
It works
changes their
really
whole,
good. Now we've
right,
done
that-
at all the IRVA, I don't say all, but almost all of the recent IRVA conferences we've done outbounders and done them for other things as well. So yeah, it's a great experimental protocol, very easy to demonstrate and highly successful in most cases.
Now, CRV is the one I've never done.
Yeah.
And the one that I've always felt sort of afraid to ever even try,
Yeah.
because it involves fancy coordinates or something.
So CRV tries to solve the same problem that the outbounder does. How do you get the viewer to the target without having to tell them what the target is, right? And so how it works is, it started off, they used coordinates, literally geographic coordinates, latitude and longitude. It's morphed beyond that for a couple reasons. One reason was that you'd have skeptics criticize the whole remote viewing thing using coordinates by saying, oh, the remote viewers have just memorized what's at the end of all the coordinates. And so you give them a coordinate and they already know it's there. Well, when you consider that there are practically, I mean, in practical terms, billions of possible coordinate combinations, memorizing what's at the end of all of those is even more of a miracle than remote viewing is.
Right.
But that, that was a problem. You kept getting criticisms, right? There's a bigger problem that's sort of related, but it actually makes it harder. And that is that when you've done enough latitude and longitude targets, and they're all in a certain area, like ours were all a lot of ours, I won't say all of them, but many of them were concentrated in the Soviet Union. You start to recognize roughly where that coordinate points. But instead of making it easier to remote view, it makes it way harder, because then you start imagining stuff, what might be at the end of it. You start trying to guess, and it tend to degrade the quality of remote viewing sessions. The further problem is, what if they want you to remote view something that they don't know where it is, like a hostage situation or a person lost in the woods or whatever? How do you do that if you have to already know where they are with the coordinates? So they came up with what they called encrypted coordinates. I'm trying to change that to tasking number now, which again, too complicated to go into right now. But the idea is that you present a series of numbers that doesn't actually have any content. Like, it isn't Latin long. It doesn't tell you what the latitude and longitude are. It's just a series of numbers that has been chosen by the person doing the tasking. We call him the tasker. The person doing the tasking, chosen by that person to stand for what the mission is. Like, remote view the Eiffel Tower is the mission. And they might give you 8675309 as the arbitrary number. I didn't ring any bells, did it?
Reminds me of a song.
Yes, I use that because it's easier to just think of that as an arbitrary
Right.
number, right? So 8675309 equals remote view the Eiffel Tower. And you give the viewer the 8675309, the viewer doesn't get to see the remote view of the Eiffel Tower part. But what happens is their subconscious goes out into the universe, whatever that means, and finds what that number is linked to. Goes looking for 8675309, finds it out there somewhere, and the subconscious says, oh, remote view the Eiffel Tower. Okay, now I know. And then it'll take your consciousness to the Eiffel Tower, speaking very loosely here, right? And it works really well. But that's all that number amounts to. People try and make sense of it. If they don't understand what its function is, they'll sit down to do a session, and you'll give them, I don't know, 8675309, and you can just see them struggling. What does that mean? What am I supposed to do? I don't know where to go. That's because their left brain, their conscious awareness, is trying to make sense of it, when they need to let go of that and just trust their inner subconscious processes to do it for them. And once you learn how to do that, it works really well. So that's what CRV was meant to solve. CRV stood for coordinate remote viewing, because we were using geographic coordinates. in 95, when it became declassified, maybe 96, Ingo then told everybody, look, I always wanted to call it controlled remote viewing, but the military didn't get that. They liked the coordinate thing, and so they kept the coordinate thing. I want to call it controlled remote viewing. And so from then on, that's what we called it, was controlled remote viewing, because his idea was, it isn't so much about how you get to the target in this case. It's more about you're controlling the process, you're disciplining the process to help lower the amount of mental noise that's coming in, which is a big problem with remote viewing, is mental noise. Lowering the amount of mental noise and controlling the process in such a way to enhance the likelihood that you're going to get accurate data and more detailed, comprehensive data than you would if you're just doing kind of a seat of the pants, what I call generic remote viewing kind of a thing.
Mhm.
And so why you're intimidated by it, is why so many other people, is because it is a very regimented, rigorous kind of approach. Now,
Mhm.
I am, and I'm using right brain and left brain here very loosely. I know the psychologists out there probably cringing, but that's okay, because it's a really useful kind of a metaphor to understand with here. So I'm really, really seriously right brain. In fact, if I were to move my camera around, you'd see that my office looks very much like an explosion in a paper factory. Right? That's the way I approach life. But in remote viewing, I am very follow this methodology, this protocol very closely. And what it does is it helps you remove the mental noise to whatever extent you can. You never get rid of it totally. And I'll talk about what that is in a minute. But it also helps you to, when you get data, be able to capture it before it disappears. So there's a famous paper from the, let me think, when it came out in the 1950s, called I think it's 7 bits plus or minus 2. The idea that our working memory can hold roughly 7 bits of data. Sometimes it's only 5 bits, sometimes it's 9 bits, but it's on average about 7 bits of data. I may get my numbers a little wrong. It's been a while since I looked at it, but, and so when you're doing remote viewing, or actually anything that involves trying to remember things, your mind coming in, if you don't capture what comes in your head immediately, whatever comes in next either overwrites it, or what's there will keep anything else from coming in. Again, I know I'm speaking a little loosely. Psychologists will have to get over that. But in general, that's the principle. And so part of the CRV process is you record everything, you verbalize everything, you get it all out. And that's it facilitates two things. It facilitates recall, it facilitates record keeping, because once you verbalize it, write it down, or sketch it, oftentimes it's a sketch of something of a shape or whatever in your mind. Once you get it down, you don't have to remember it anymore, right? And it frees up your mind to allow more data to come in. But it's a very kind of a structured process to make this happen. It has to be by just by the nature of this, right? And so people look at this very kind of strictly ordered format on the page. They look at all the things that a CRV remote viewer has to learn and all of that stuff, and it freaks them out. The way they don't understand, it's just like anything else. It's like playing the piano, right? Somebody who's never played the piano before, the very prospect of learning that is intimidating. But once you spend a few years at it and you've got it down, you don't even have to think about it anymore. You just play, right? If you have a sheet of music in your sight reading, you see what's on the page, but your fingers do. You don't even have to think about what your fingers are doing, right? And so that's kind of a CRV. Yes, it is strict, it is rigorous, but that serves an important function, actually several important functions. And that's why it works really well. The unfortunate thing is a lot of people play with the process. And so you'll find lots of flavors of CRV out there. You find lots of people who take CRV and turn it into something else. And they're doing it through logic. They think, well, if this works, then this will work. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? But you know, not all CRV is created equal. That's practiced out there now. Some of it works better than others. I'm still a firm believer that the original has not been improved upon. In fact, generally speaking, the new things that have been introduced have actually made it less effective in general than the CRV. So it's arranged into 6 stages. Each stage, the first stage is is you just get the gestalt of the target. In other words, you determine whether it's land, water, structure, event, activity, or person, right? Or, varieties of that. Generally, we focus on land, water, structure. People think, well, that's kind of a limited target set, isn't it? And no, there is almost an infinite number of possible targets that you would never even think about being a target that falls into one or another of those categories or a combination. Okay. The next stage, stage 2, is all about the sensory experience that you're having. Remember, your senses aren't doing this, but the sensory centers in our brains do seem to be activated by some kind of stimulus that our consciousness is picking up at the target, just bypasses our senses in some non-local way, right?
I always
So,
find I have like an emotional response to some of the
well, that
targets.
comes next, actually.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So you get the sensory experience, but as the sensory experience grows and you get more data, and there's we call it the aperture. It's as if something expands inside your mind to allow more data in. When that happens, then you start getting a subjective response. It can be emotional. It's because at this point your subconscious is able to kind of interpret more about what's going on there, right? And so, for example, the target is a concentration camp. At some point, your subconscious at least will realize, oh, this is really bad. And you'll have a very negative emotional reaction. Or it
Mhm.
might be something really beautiful.
Mhm.
And you consciously don't yet know what it is, but your subconscious recognizes, oh, this is beautiful. You have a wonderful kind of a response. Um, and then you get into what we call stage 4, which is where you start getting details. Like if it's the Eiffel Tower, where in stage 1 through 3, you might get tall, metallic, and draw a sketch kind of like this, and crisscrossing and airy and all that. In stage 4, you start getting, oh, foreign, maybe French, tourism, national pride, monumental, memorial, in an urban setting. So you get that in stage 4. I'm going to skip to stage 5 because that's kind of specialty thing. And then you get into stage 6. And if you've seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you've seen somebody doing stage 6 CRV. Because in stage 6, you can actually build a clay model of the target. It's like Richard Dreyfuss building Devil's Tower out of mashed potatoes on his dining room table in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right?
I
In
don't.
the meantime, you're still getting the kind of data that you get in stage 4. So, and there are other components to it. I mean, you can access, I don't want to call it telepathy, but you can kind of seem to be able to access the mental contents of people at a target. You're able to go forward and backwards in time to some degree using timelines. We've integrated dowsing into the process to help locate things and so on. So I don't know, that's pretty quick down and dirty. Does that help you in terms of what CRV is or what it's
I
like?
did not know that it entailed all those things you just
Uh,
said, plus the different steps, which I understand
yeah,
because of how different my remote viewing is now,
yeah.
say from when I first began. I
Mhm.
can't draw at all, so I have to tell them what that drawing is with a little arrow and say,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, this is a
So
bill.
what I want to say here is, don't say you can't draw at all. Say you haven't yet been able to draw.
I'm still drawing like a kindergartner, and I hope to be able to draw as more of an
There is
adult.
a cure for that. A
Okay.
cure for that. In fact, I recommend a book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain.
Drawing on the right
Yeah,
side.
nothing beats live instruction.
Mhm.
Really seriously, live instruction is really helpful in remote viewing as well as art. But if you don't have that luxury, that book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, is almost a miracle for in terms of helping people's skills at being able to sketch and draw.
That would be great because I always feel afterward that Russell says, "What is that?" I say, "Oh,
Yeah,
well,
I know. I've done that with a bunch of my students too.
I also there was one quick thing I wanted to say also about because I was rereading the Essential Guide to Remote Viewing,
Mhm,
and I want to mention that I also thought, was I reading people's minds?
mhm.
And I had an experience that showed me I wasn't reading anyone's mind. And after I learned that, then I knew that this was an operation of something else. But I used to do, as a teenager, I did medical diagnosis on stage in front of hundreds of people for this guy, Werner Erhard. And I would go to see family and visit people, and they'd say, oh, would you do one on me? Or could you tell me about whatever?
Mm.
So I do my dear friend Esther's mother. And as I'm doing her body, I'm saying, oh, she had a broken leg. And my friend says, no, she never had a broken leg. I've known, it's my mother, never heard of that. She goes back and tells the mother, and the mother said, oh yeah, when I was a teenager, I broke my leg. And this was really, so I knew then that I was not reading her mind. The information was coming, and it was detailed information, broken leg, la, 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 detailed. And so that meant something else was going on, but I was only a teenager, so I had no idea what was going on. This was the early 70s. So I've been very grateful for having met Dean and Russell and all these amazing people, and the remote viewing and all these other things that I've had in being a subject in scientific experiments. And I'm just so glad that all you are out there still talking about it. And I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but there's a couple of questions here that there's a couple that I really don't want to miss out on. And
Well, now we can always do this again. Don't
we
forget.
could do this, that would be good too.
Yeah.
But there's two things. I was wondering, because for me now, if in all these years, what do you believe is the most important thing for you to be doing with remote viewing, and why? Because I've done so many things that I'm like, does it matter about a sports event to me? No. Or does this thing, how can I help a person? And the only person that I had experience with where they told me they used remote viewing to help people was a gentleman named Randy Zanesis, who was on our show. And he was doing remote viewing for water in drought areas in Africa with a map and coordinates. And he was able
Really?
to locate places for them to drill. And they successfully found water, and he helped like 5 villages. One of them offered him their daughter and some chickens, and he said, no, my wife will not allow me to have your daughter. But that idea to me was like, wow, that's a great use of RV. So I was wondering, I don't mean that it wasn't a great use when you were looking for military.
Right.
I just mean in
So so first off, actually what he's doing sounds more like dowsing, like map dowsing. But
maybe
I don't know how he's applying it. I'd be interested in talking to him sometime, perhaps.
Oh yeah, he's a fascinating gentleman.
Yeah.
Stephen Schwartz, I met him. I was in a remote viewing group for Stephen Schwartz, and that's where I met him. And Stephen kept raving about him on our group. He's a special guy, and he really is.
Well, maybe we can arrange a crossing of the paths at some point.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what applications do you see as far as?
So yeah, obviously there's a lot of ways you can use remote viewing, and I also want to let people know it doesn't always work, right?
No.
It just works better than the alternative in most cases, right? It's a go-to thing when you can't solve the problem any other way you can, but it works often enough. It's a real thing. It's a real thing. I mean, the military and the research folks associated with the military program have a ton of well-developed evidence that proves that. So there's lots of things you can do with it. Obviously, we use it in the military to find Russian weapons or Soviet weapon systems, stuff, and hostages in the Middle East and that kind of thing. But today people are using it for investments, and people say, well, if you're psychic, why aren't you rich? There are people out here that are making money with remote viewing, and it's demonstrable that it does work for that. You've talked about medical RV and all that stuff, and there's lots of practical applications. I probably every few days or week or so, I get a phone call from somebody or an email who wants me to do a project for them. And I have done projects before. Obviously, that's all I did in the military when I wasn't training other people. But my problem is, I'm 70 years old now.
Well, you look great.
I'm not getting younger, and I'm not getting more energy, right? At some point, I'm not going to be doing this anymore. And it's kind of like teach them how to fish kind of a thing, right? I could be doing these operations. I would much rather not do them because they take a lot of time, they take a lot of energy. And when it's done, I've done one operation, but when I retire or die or whatever, that's it, right? I would much rather be out there teaching people how to do this. And that's my main activity. On a few rare occasions, I'll get involved, usually as a viewer on an operation, if I think it really is worthwhile or it won't take too much time. But generally, I want to teach people how to do it. Now, yeah, obviously it's an income generator for me, but that is, if that is, I just got the wake up call.
Oh,
that is obviously, now I've totally lost my train of thought.
you're,
Oh, right. So the more people I can teach how to be competent remote viewers, the more likely the skill is going to continue, and the more people there are out there who can do operations competently. There's a lot of folks out there who don't know what they're doing. They think they're remote viewers, they're not. They think that they know how to do remote viewing operations, they don't. And there's a lot of other people out there who do remote viewing operations, they're actually probably pretty good, but they waste their time on what I call anomaly targets, UFO events and Bigfoot and conspiracy theory stuff, which to me, first of all, in the end, they never can prove sufficiently what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, or was Kennedy really, was it just Oswald that was the only shooter? They people remote view all this stuff, but in the end, they don't have anything that's actionable, and they've had a lot of fun, but they haven't advanced civilization an inch. And so I want to teach people how to be good operational remote viewers and encourage them to do contributory operational remote viewing that makes a difference.
yes.
Finding missing kids, even investing. That's provides a value added, right? Whatever, trying to do research with it in terms of human consciousness, or other kinds of research is more concrete. We had one remote viewing project that they experimented remote viewing at the micro cell level. Bacteriophages is what the technical term is, and so that kind of stuff I think is worthy. That's well worth doing. I do get involved a bit in the UFO world, partly because of my interest in consciousness in it, which is connected with remote viewing, obviously. We should talk UFOs another time, so I can explain what my boundary conditions are in terms of remote viewing and UFOs. But yeah, I think that my biggest contribution today is to help other people become competent remote viewers, so that this can continue on in spite of the noise level that's out there in the remote viewing world. Yeah. So anyway,
I just have to share this because we're talking about UFOs, and Russell and I just completed a 13 remote viewing sessions together here.
Yeah.
And we did it on the phone, and then we turned into Zoom, so that I have at least 5 of them recorded that we did together.
Mm-hmm.
And they were always an object sitting on his desk.
Ah.
So it's just an object, it's there. And then after we remote view, then he would, like hold up the object, and I take a picture of it, and I get validated knowing what's what. And he asked me to do one after we finished our 12th or 11th remote viewing. And he said, this is a photograph. And we weren't doing photographs, we were just doing objects.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I'm doing the photograph, the first thing I say is, I feel like it's a rocket ship, and we're talking about propulsion, and I'm drawing these circular things like this in the drawings. And at the end, and the first thing I say to him, and there's a lot of nature in the picture. And he says, let me stop you right there. We took the nature out of the picture.
Ah.
And I'm going to show you the picture.
Okay.
Here's the picture. This is the book that I'm making of our work together.
Ah, okay.
And he said that he had shown that picture to Jacques Vallée, who's a respected UFOologist, I guess, or writer.
Uh-huh.
And he said that no one would be able to remote view that target because it was interdimensional. And I wasn't sure what he meant. He said, well, actually, you use the word propulsion, he said, and you've never used that word since I've known you. I'm not a scientist. And when we finished, I got a 6 out of a 7 on the Targ rating for this, for
Wow.
the remote viewing. I wondered what so then he contacted Jacques Vallée and said, yes, this photo is remote viewable.
Huh.
So I didn't.
Because you'd proved it.
What's that?
Because you had proved that.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
didn't know going in. I just thought he said another a photo. The other things
Yeah.
were actually objects. So I could have been thinking it was a photo of an object, but instead I was, I was in a rocket ship, I knew he didn't have a miniature. I didn't have a rocket ship on his desk. So I found it fascinating to think about remote viewing, like what would have been inside that, or so I'm not sure whether there's been work, I assume. So I felt what we did was reputable. I don't think it was
Yeah, and I have less of a problem remote viewing legitimate UFO kinds of targets done properly with the right protocols and stuff, because that may be an important thing to know about, right? And I've done some of that kind of stuff and run projects like that. It's the fact that there are so many loosey-goosey things going on out there, far more loosey-goosey things than there are legitimate things. And so I tend to be very critical.
Well, no, I feel the same way. I never even like to bring up the subject or discuss it because so much out there seems a little crazy to me. But then I always have to say, well, just because you don't, I had some kind of experience like that in my 20s and I never spoke about it to anyone. And so there's this other thing about this UFO going ons that if people don't share their experience, if it's an authentic experience, I wasn't sure if mine was a dream or what was really happening, but it was something that I never wanted to talk about. And I just find it interesting to hear all these people where they talk about there's teams and there's different types of alien, and it just like goes so way out there for me that I just figured it was better not to even touch on the subject.
Yeah, that's a problem, and something we can talk about next time.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to pull the plug on this.
Okay, well, so we're getting to the end, and I just want to ask one last question. Is ESP real? And if so, why does that matter? Let's leave our guests with something to think about.
We'll leave them to think about it. I'm not going to answer that question because it would take me another 15 minutes.
So we'll do that on our next show.
Absolutely.
We're leaving for something for them to think about. And I just want to thank you for your time and all that you're doing. And I think I should sign up for one of your classes so that I can learn your CRV method, because it sounded very interesting.
I think you'd find it less painful than you think. So, yeah. I mean, it's still a lot of work. I'm not kidding you. This is a serious training program.
Yeah.
But it's done in such a way that it's not going to be too painful for anybody. So
anyone who's interested, you'll find the descriptions and contacts at the end of our show here. Everything will be listed there, so you'll know how to find out where Paul is and where to contact him and find out more things he's doing. I do recommend you check out his book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. I also recommend that I would love to, on another show, talk about dowsing and the shows that you have.
Sure.
So thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank everyone for subscribing, liking, sharing. I'd like to thank you to my family for producing this show for me. And everybody have a really, really wonderful week ahead. Thanks so much for being here. And it's been just a pleasure.
I've had a great time. I'll look forward to the next one.
I'm looking forward to it too. You have a great week ahead, and say hi to everyone.
I shall. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, Paul.
We'll see you later.
Yeah, well, we'll see you somewhere.